In most homes today, the flame is just a click away. But during World War II, across bombed-out cities and silent countryside kitchens, that flame vanished. Fuel lines were cut, matches were rationed, fire meant smoke, and smoke meant danger. Yet families still cooked, not with fire, but with insulation, pressure, fermentation, and patience. Meals were prepared without a single spark. In rural villages of Eastern Europe, women sealed boiling pots in hay-filled crates. In the Alps, food was buried in hot ash and left to slow cook underground. In the shadows of occupation, children steeped oats in thermal bottles carried beneath coats. These weren't shortcuts. They were necessities. Each method carved from hardship, tested not in theory, but in collapse. And today, almost all of them are forgotten. This isn't about old recipes. This is about what civilians did when the fire went out and never came back. If even one of these World War II survival methods makes you rethink what cooking really means, subscribe, because survival didn't start with fire. It started when the fire was gone. Number 1. Haybox cooking during World War II. When fuel became more valuable than food itself, civilians across occupied Europe were forced to find new ways to cook. With coal deliveries halted, firewood stolen, and every flame a potential signal to patrolling soldiers, many households turned to an old but vital technique, haybox cooking. It required no continuous fire, just one brief boil followed by insulation and time. A haybox wasn't a factory-made device. It was a wooden crate, a wicker basket, or even a drawer lined with thick hay, rags, or wool blankets. In bombed-out homes and countryside cottages, housewives would bring a pot of stew, oats, or grains to a full rolling boil on the fire. Then, without delay, they sealed it inside the haybox, packing insulation tightly around all sides. The trapped heat continued cooking the meal slowly over hours, with no fuel, no smoke, and no need to tend flames. In many World War II-era kitchens, this method became routine. Morning fires were used to boil food. By mid-morning, pots were buried in hay. Come evening, the food was soft, hot, and ready to eat. Despite not touching fire for hours, in winter, hayboxes were moved closer to chimneys or buried beneath blankets to preserve heat longer. Some even added preheated bricks beside the pots to extend cooking time. The advantages were critical. No lingering smoke to draw attention, no constant need for firewood, no risk of chimney sparks during air raids. But it wasn't foolproof. If the food wasn't fully boiling before sealing, it spoiled. If the insulation was thin, the heat escaped. It required discipline, a wartime virtue, and a deep understanding of timing. Still, for countless families in wartime Britain, Poland, France, and beyond, haybox cooking became the only way to stretch limited ingredients without wasting precious fuel. It turned heat into memory, captured, preserved, and used without fire. Could you cook a full meal on yesterday's heat alone? Subscribe to uncover the wartime systems that made every spark last. Number 2. Thermal bottles steeping in the kitchens of wartime Europe. Where firewood was rare and silence often meant survival, civilians learned to make boiling water last. One of the most overlooked, yet widespread techniques was thermal bottle steeping, a method used by World War II families to cook grains, legumes, and even roots, using nothing but retained heat. Thermal bottles, often salvaged from soldiers' gear or made from double-walled containers, became cooking vessels in their own right. In towns across war-torn France and occupied Poland, mothers would boil water briefly over a morning flame, then pour it straight into insulated bottles pre-packed with oats, barley, lentils, or dried vegetables. Once sealed tightly, the bottle was wrapped in cloth or tucked beneath bedding to trap heat. No further flame, no smoke, just time and patience. This technique was especially valuable during blackouts, curfews, and fuel shortages. Students and workers carried these thermal bottles through ruins and checkpoints, knowing they'd open them at noon to find soft, warm food, not gourmet, but vital. Children learned how to measure grain levels, seal lids properly, and judge steeping time by the bottle's warmth. But results demanded discipline. The water had to be boiling. The seal had to hold. In extreme cold, some families doubled the insulation with hay or wool. If the steep failure, the food remained raw and hard, a waste no one could afford. Still, when perfected, it delivered. The steeped food wasn't just soft, it was efficient. It used no fuel after the boil, required no tending, and could be prepared quietly under threat. Some households kept several bottles going throughout the day, one for meals, one for tea, one for infant food. In cities like Lviv and Rotterdam, steeping replaced simmering. In cellars and ruins, it became a silent form of resistance. This was not modern convenience. This was a war era necessity, and it proved one powerful truth. Even after the fire was gone, boiling could continue. If one bottle of boiling water could carry you through a meal, would you know how to use it? Subscribe to remember what war once taught about heat, hunger, and survival. Number 3. Stone boil cooking across the war-ravaged countryside of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, where metal pots cracked and fire drew dangerous attention. A centuries-old technique returned from memory. Stone boil cooking. It was raw, primitive, and silent. Exactly what civilians needed when wood was gone, and open flames meant risk. The logic was simple. Heat the stone, not the pot. In World War II's hardest-hit regions, families would collect dry, dense stones, often river-smoothed granite or fieldstones. These were placed directly into embers or wood ash and left to superheat until glowing. Meanwhile, a wooden trough, clay vessel, or salvaged metal pail was filled with water and food, peeled potatoes, cabbage, or wild grains. Then, one by one, the stones were transferred using branches or tongs, dropped carefully into the liquid. The contact released intense, localized heat. The water hissed. The food was cooked. No fire under the pot, no smoke above it. It wasn't convenient. The stones cooled quickly and had to be replaced every few minutes. Water darkened with ash. If the rocks were too porous or wet, they cracked violently, sometimes shattering the vessel. But if selected carefully and cycled with precision, the method worked. Cooks could reach boiling temperatures, soften root vegetables, cook dried peas, and even prepare coarse broths, all without direct flame. In forest hideouts and bombed city outskirts, this method became more than cooking. It became survival camouflage. No firelight flickered in the dark. No cooking smoke drifted toward enemy patrols. Meals were prepared behind walls, under tree cover, in silence. Mothers taught their children which stones held heat the longest. Some families buried their vessels in shallow earth trenches to trap steam and extend cooking time. Stone boil cooking was slow, messy, and dangerous. But for families hiding in barns, ruins, or forest shelters, it was the only way to transform cold water and scraps into warmth. This was not innovation. It was return to a method older than the war, older than memory, made necessary once again by silence, scarcity, and discipline. Could you make a boiling pot without fire? Subscribe to recover the wartime knowledge carved into rock and ruin. Number 4. Insulated barrel cooking in the harsh winters of wartime Germany, Austria, and parts of occupied Scandinavia. Entire families lived in basements, barns, or abandoned structures where fires were forbidden or impossible. Yet meals still had to be made. One of the most ingenious methods that emerged during this time was insulated barrel cooking, a large-scale variation of the Haybox concept built for bulk and silence. Instead of small crates, families repurposed large wooden barrels, often used for grain or pickling, and lined them heavily with straw, cloth, old wool, or any available insulation. Into this, they would lower a large pot that had been brought briefly to a boil using shared or borrowed fire. The barrel's tight fit and multiple layers ensured minimal heat loss. A padded lid, often made from rags tied around a wooden board, sealed the top. What entered hot remained hot, sometimes for 6 to 8 hours. This wasn't just for stews or soups. In many rural areas, families cooked grains for animals and humans alike, softened beans, or even fermented starter dough overnight. Because the barrels could accommodate larger pots, the technique allowed for group cooking, neighbors pooling ingredients and preparing food in turns, conserving every flame, every ember. Barrels were hidden in corners, behind blankets, even beneath piles of clothing to mask their warmth from the outside world. In some cases, families buried the base of the barrel partially in the ground to stabilize temperature further. During patrol sweeps, the cooking could continue in silence. No flame, no light, no risk. But this method had its flaws. If the insulation was too loose or the pot not hot enough, food spoiled. If the barrel was damp, mold developed. Yet for those who managed it well, insulated barrel cooking became the backbone of winter survival, especially in regions cut off from all supply chains. It wasn't just a cooking technique. It was a reminder that, even in the absence of energy, discipline could preserve warmth. Would your food stay hot if your fire lasted only minutes? Subscribe to restore the systems that turned barrels into ovens and silence into survival. Number 5. Solar reflector, drying in the sunlit ruins of southern France, rural Greece, and the Ukrainian steppe, where firewood was hoarded and ovens stood cold. Civilians learned to cook without heat at all by harnessing the sun. During World War II, solar reflector drying became one of the quietest and most efficient techniques used by peasants to soften, warm, and preserve food when flames were too costly to risk. The method was born from necessity, not invention. Broken mirrors, sheets of tin, polished metal scraps, all scavenged from bombed buildings, were angled to concentrate sunlight onto bowls or plates filled with sliced vegetables, soaked grains, or softened roots. Food was elevated on wire racks, cloth slings, or repurposed window screens. The reflectors didn't create intense heat, but over hours, they warmed the food evenly, removing moisture and preparing it for storage or immediate consumption. In places like Sicily, parts of North Africa, and Crimea, where midday sun was relentless, solar reflector drying became an essential tool. Tomatoes were halved and salted. Zucchini and onions were sliced thin. Even soaked lentils and barley were partially cooked this way, not boiled, but softened, to the point where further preparation was minimal. Some families added glass panels above the racks to trap heat, creating primitive solar ovens without fire. The process was painstaking. Food had to be turned often. Wind and insects were constant threats. On cloudy days, drying halted completely. But the benefits outweighed the inconvenience. Dried vegetables lasted for months. Softened grains could be rehydrated overnight in cloth-wrapped jars. In regions under strict curfew or with surveillance, the absence of firelight or smoke meant one thing: safety. Children were often tasked with adjusting reflectors throughout the day to follow the shifting sun. In some villages, multiple families built communal reflector frames on rooftops or in abandoned courtyards, working silently to feed themselves without flame. Solar reflector drying wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. But it proved that heat wasn't always the starting point for food. Sometimes patience and sunlight were enough. Could you make a meal using only broken metal and the sun? Subscribe to reclaim the wartime systems that turned silence and salvage into sustenance. Number 6. Fermentation pots across World War II or Eastern Europe. From Lithuanian farmsteads to Ukrainian villages, fire wasn't just scarce, it was often forbidden. In regions where occupying forces controlled forests and entire communities were stripped of fuel, civilians turned inward. They looked not to flame, but to time. And in their cellars and pantries, fermentation pots became silent kitchens, turning raw vegetables into preserved, softened, and nutritious meals without a single spark. Fermentation wasn't new. But during the war, it became a cornerstone of survival. Stoneware crocks, earthen jugs, or salvaged barrels were packed with cabbage, turnips, carrots, even green beans, layered with salt, weighted with stones, and sealed with cloth. Over days and weeks, natural bacteria transformed the food. Starches broke down, textures softened, vitamins increased. Most importantly, no cooking was needed. In Polish villages, women prepared massive batches of sauerkraut, not for flavor, but function. The process extended shelf life by months and made even the toughest vegetables digestible. In Balkan communities, fermented beetroot brine replaced broth. In rural Hungary, soaked and soured wheat was mashed into a porridge that required no flame, just time. These pots were kept in cool corners of cellars, hidden beneath blankets or burlap. Children were taught to skim the top daily, to press down the contents, to recognize the smell of a good ferment from one gone bad. Clean water, clean hands, and discipline were the only tools needed. The result: meals that nourished without heat, without fuel, and without revealing a home's presence to patrolling soldiers. The limits were clear. Fermentation took time. The flavor was sharp, unfamiliar to outsiders, and failure meant entire stores spoiled. But for those who mastered it, these pots replaced cooking altogether. They made food edible, storable, and healing, with no dependence on fire or technology. It was chemistry powered by instinct, a quiet process in a louder war. If your flame vanished for a season, could time become your stove? Subscribe to the wartime methods that softened food with nothing but patience and salt. Number 7. Clay pot burying in the rural outskirts of World War II Romania, Serbia, and parts of occupied Greece. Fire was neither practical nor safe. Chimneys drew attention. Smoke betrayed positions. Entire villages survived on techniques that didn't involve flames at all. One of the oldest and most reliable was clay pot burying, the practice of cooking or slow softening food underground, using nothing but residual earth heat and insulation. Families would begin early, often before sunrise. A tightly sealed clay pot was filled with soaked grains, root vegetables, or even animal bones. Anything that could benefit from long, low heat. The pots were placed into shallow pits previously warmed by fire or coals. Sometimes ash was raked into the hole first to raise the baseline temperature. Then, the pot was buried beneath dirt, straw, or even bricks, left untouched for 6 to 8 hours, sometimes longer. The technique mimicked the insulation of an oven, but drew its heat from the memory of fire and the stability of earth. In mountainous areas, hot stones were sometimes added to the pit to intensify the initial warmth. The pot absorbed the slow ambient temperature. Food inside softened, absorbed moisture, and slowly cooked, not to searing temperatures, but enough to break down starches and release flavor. This was not a method for haste. Timing was everything. If the pit was too shallow, heat escaped. If the pot wasn't sealed well, insects or soil contaminated the food. But when done correctly, families could return at dusk to a warm, hearty meal, all without lighting a visible fire or exposing themselves to risk. Clay pot burying wasn't just clever, it was invisible. No fire, no tools, no trace. In regions under constant surveillance, this invisibility meant the difference between nourishment and exposure. Even today, few understand how civilians used the earth itself to cook. It wasn't about digging. It was about listening to the heat that lingered after the fire and using it without reigniting risk. If you lost fire, would you know how to feed yourself from the soil beneath you? Subscribe to recover the systems that once made Earth itself a stove. Number 8. Sour milk soaking in the occupied villages of World War II Latvia, Slovakia, and parts of rural Germany. Even boiling water became a luxury. Fuel was gone, fire was dangerous, and time itself had to be repurposed. In these regions, civilians found a way to prepare food not by heat, but by fermentation and soaking. One of the most overlooked yet quietly essential methods was the use of sour milk to soften starches. When milk began to turn, not spoiled, but naturally soured, it was never wasted. Instead, it was poured over oats, barley, buckwheat, or dry bread scraps in wooden bowls or ceramic basins. Left covered for several hours, sometimes overnight, the lactic acid in the milk began breaking down the fibers in the grains. This softened the texture, created a tangy but digestible mixture, and replaced cooking entirely. Peasants in wartime Bavaria often soaked coarse rye bread in clapboard milk to make a porridge that could be eaten cold. In Transylvanian mountain villages, dried maize was ground and soaked in fermented whey to create a thick mash, served with wild herbs or preserved fats. These meals were filling, quiet to prepare, and used what nature had already begun to change. The key was cleanliness and timing. The milk had to be sour, but not rotten. Containers had to be kept cool. And once the soaking was complete, food had to be eaten promptly. There were no second chances. Still, for those with no fire, this method turned spoiled milk into nourishment. No waste, no flame, no noise. It wasn't palatable to all. But to families who hadn't seen coal or wood in months, it meant the difference between going hungry or eating what the land still offered. If your kitchen went cold forever, could you still eat from what nature left behind? Subscribe to restore the knowledge that once turned sour milk into survival. Number 9. Steam trap stones during the harsh occupation winters in mountainous regions of Albania, Bosnia, and remote parts of the Carpathians. Families could no longer afford the glow of firelight. Soldiers patrolled even remote terrain, and any sign of warmth could trigger suspicion. The method became known locally as steam trap cooking, and it relied on one thing: holding the heat in rather than generating it. Large flat stones were heated during the early hours of permitted fire use, brief windows when small cooking fires could be made without drawing attention. These stones, once hot, were pulled from the coals and placed at the bottom of insulated boxes or shallow pits. Over them, soaked grains, chopped vegetables, or wild greens were arranged on metal plates or thick cloth sacks. A layer of wet cloth, often wool or flax wasp, stretched over the food. Then, another warmed stone was set on top, pressing the seal tight. The steam that rose from the hot stone and dampened cloth became trapped within the enclosure, circulating through the food. This method worked in silence. No boiling sound, no fire crackle, no scent trail. Within 2 to 3 hours, the food beneath was steamed soft coarse barley, shredded potatoes, even wild garlic leaves. It wasn't elegant, it didn't brown or sear, but it made food safe, warm, and digestible without the constant presence of a flame. Some families built permanent steam boxes from old wooden crates, lining the interiors with clay or metal scrap to retain moisture and resist rot. Others used earthen pits lined with straw, covered with stone lids. What mattered was containment. Heat wasn't chased, was captured and rationed like everything else. If the cloth dried too fast, food burned. If the stones cracked, the system collapsed. It demanded attention to detail and absolute discipline. Yet, in homes where the hearth had gone cold forever, this method kept people fed. Quietly, invisibly, and safely. Could you feed a family without letting the world know you're even cooking? Number 10. Boil one's multi-pots in the cramped blackout kitchens of wartime Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France. The rhythm of daily life was reduced to essentials: one flame, one pot, one chance to cook, and no room for waste. Out of this pressure, a method emerged that civilians came to rely on with precision. Boil once, multi-pots. It was less a tool and more a strategy, using a single boiling session to prepare multiple meals across the day without returning to the flame. The principle was simple: stacked cooking vessels by heat priority. The bottom pot, in direct contact with the flame, cooked the hardest ingredients: dried beans, roots, bones. Above that, a secondary pot rested on a trivet containing grains or chopped vegetables that needed less heat. A third, often makeshift tin or bowl, held soaked bread, fruit, or milk-based mixtures that required only warming or softening. Once everything was boiling, the pots were removed together, each sealed in thick cloth or hay and placed into separate insulated containers, crates, barrels, or even bedding. No fire remained, but the residual heat in each vessel continued to work for hours. By midday, the upper pot was ready, usually porridge or vegetable stew. By night, the bottom pot, still warm, held softened legumes or bone broth. Some families even scheduled meals by pot depth: top for breakfast, middle for lunch, bottom for supper. The strategy demanded planning, but saved every gram of fuel and minute of exposure. This method became especially popular during times of strict curfew and aerial surveillance. The fire was lit once, at dawn, then extinguished, before daylight revealed chimney trails. Children learned to handle hot pots with cloth. Elders packed insulation tightly. Households passed down exact boiling times like inherited recipes. The limits were real. Mistime the order, and food undercooked or spoiled. Use thin insulation, and heat fades too soon. But when used properly, boil once multi-pots allowed a single rationed flame to stretch across an entire day and sometimes longer. In today's world of constant reheating and digital timers, this system is almost unimaginable. Yet in homes with broken windows and empty coal bins, it became a silent miracle. Proof that the real power wasn't in flame, but in how wisely it was spent. Could one fire feed your family 3 times? Subscribe to remember the wartime systems that made every spark sacred. We often think survival begins with tools: fire starters, stoves, stockpiles. But during World War II, civilians proved otherwise. They cooked without fire, preserved without cold, softened food without metal or flame. Because when the fuel ran out, what remained was patience and knowledge. These weren't experiments. They were necessities, carried out in ruins, whispered through walls, passed down not in books, but in muscle memory. Today, these methods are nearly erased, replaced by instant meals, electric buttons, and disposable habits. But what fed millions in silence still matters. Not for nostalgia, but for resilience. Because the next failure won't ask if you're ready. It'll ask if you remember. If even one of these wartime methods made you pause, then don't scroll past it. Subscribe now, because survival won't wait for a fire, and neither should you.